Good morning and welcome to the May 22nd CropTalk webinar. If you have any questions during the presentations, please type them into the question tab and we'll answer them at the end of the presentations. Lionel, you're up.
Hey, I'd like to welcome everybody to Crop Talk for May the 22nd. It's been another busy week for a lot of the producers as a lot of the crop is being put in the ground and kind of getting to the tail end here right now. And I thought it would be a good time to talk about some of the insect issues we may be facing over the next week to 10 days as crop starts coming up through the ground and conditions maybe improve for some of these insects to start doing some damage or doing some stuff to crops. So I thought it'd be good to get John Gavlowski to come on and go through, I guess, some of the insects we should be watching for, how we should be looking at scouting for them, and just their overall management of them. And then from there, we'll go on to a bit of a crop update. There's been a couple of things that have been happening over the past week that I thought would be good to bring to your attention. So with that, I think we'll turn it over to John, and he'll give us an update on insects.
John, you'll just have to click to accept to become the presenter.
I am now off mute. Sorry about that.
Okay.
You can hear me now, Lionel?
You bet.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so just to jump right into the presentation, this is going to be a bit of a review of some of the early season insects that we commonly see. So we'll go over the different cutworm species and how they differ and what you can expect and do should they get to be a problem. We'll certainly go over flea beetles, how to assess damage and how to make decisions and control options. And I'll give you a bit of an update on diamondback moth and grasshoppers and a few other insects that you might want to be watching for during the season.
John, you're going to have to click to display your screen. It says that it's waiting to view your screens. There should be a button to click up at the top.
Okay. Show screen. Here we go. Okay, I'm clicking where it says show screen and nothing is happening currently.
Okay, just give me 1 second here. I'm gonna go. I'll resend you the invite to be presenter. Okay. Should be giving you that message again.
Yes. And it's saying stopped. No one can see your screen. Yeah, so I've hit that a few times, the show button, and nothing is happening currently.
Switch back to Lionel's screen for a second.
We can see my screen. Let me go right to show my screen, right?
Yeah, I'm just switching it back to yours and we'll try John's again. Okay. So now, John, I'm hitting the button to make you the presenter again.
Okay.
Now give that one more shot.
Same result, it looks like.
Hi, John.
Well, it worked in practice, so.
Not 100% sure what's going on.
Is your presentation saved in a drive where I could open it and show my screen?
Yeah, it's in the, well, It's in the U drive, so maybe not actually. Do you want me to really quickly email that to you?
Why don't we give that a try? Lionel, do you want me to switch the presentation over to you and you can do your part while I'm waiting for that email?
Let's do that. Yep.
Perfect. Okay,
And
John,
then you
so
can,
shoot that to me in an email, and I'm just going to make Lionel the presenter for now.
Okay.
okay. So we all can see my screen now?
Yes.
Great. Okay, sorry for the little problem there, everybody, but we'll get that under control. And once we have John's presentation, we'll go back, and John will be at the end of the session today. But anyways, to start off today, I'm going to give a little bit of an update as to what we've been seeing here out in the fields. And one of the things I have noticed this year is that a lot of the peas are coming up very slow, and it's just probably a factor of the cool soil and the length of time it's taking them to absorb enough moisture to get up and through the ground. But they definitely are coming now, definitely starting to row them, and they seem to have managed okay. It just seems like it's been taking a little extra time. So where are we with seeding and the crop staging in the southwest here? I guess seeding, most of the cereals are in right now, and actually the majority of them are, if they're not emerging, they're close to being through the soil surface. The dry conditions are definitely affecting some of the later seeded crop, and some of those are taking a little bit longer to come up, and the crop is coming up slow, and there's definitely patches in the field that still haven't emerged, and it's all going to be a factor if they were put into soil that was had moisture, or soil that maybe was overly worked this spring and dried out. Canola, it's about 70% done, and there was a time there where some of the guys had stopped seeding just to wait for conditions to warm up. And now I think there's a few guys that have actually stopped just because of the fact that it's so dry, and most of the producers I talk to now that are seeding canola are basically just putting it into dry dirt. It seems like with the wind and the lack of rainfall, anytime you go out and open up the soil, even into that, half to 3/4 of an inch, it seems like it just dries down to that layer, and we're having seeds sit in dry ground. This past week, soybeans started going in a fair bit of the area out here, and we're about half done that right now. I think some guys actually switched from canola and went into soybeans just because they could plant it a little bit deeper and hopefully get it into some of that moisture. And then with some of the forecast guys are hoping that maybe we would see some rain. Germination and emerging crops have been slow. Limiting factor, as I mentioned, is moisture. And I think overall we're about 75% done seeding, with actually some producers have completed and are just waiting for the crop to come up to start looking at some. If the crop isn't up, some guys are still doing some pre-emerge weed control right now because some of the weeds have started. But in a lot of cases, guys are waiting for the crop to come up and get ready for spraying. So where does that put us kind of compared to average? We're ahead of the average this year, 84%. I guess we're sitting as a province right now, compared to our 5-year average at 72%, and our last year we were about 80% at this time. One of the interesting things I found is when we compared that to where we compare it right now to the United States. They're looking at about 70% of their wheat being in the ground right now, which is below their 5-year average. The real interesting ones is when you look at soybeans, they're only about 20% done. And then when you look at corn, they're only about 50% done. So they're well below their 5-year average. And a lot of that is due to what we've been seeing for rainfall in the States over the past, 3 to 4 weeks, and even in some of the states this past week they've been getting snow, so it's definitely been slowing them down, and definitely going to affect some of the cropping decisions, I think, over the next little while here. When you look at our weather forecast, our weather from the last week, you definitely see that we still getting very cool nights with minimum temperatures in pretty much every location of over the past 8 days in the negative range. Average temperatures, still below our average. We're, anywhere from that 8 to 10 degrees. And rainfall is the big thing. We're definitely below our rainfall amounts, as you see on the far right when you look at our percent of normal. And we're well below our percent of normal for this time of year. And it's definitely showing when you look at forage crops, especially. They are really suffering right now, as well as pastures. And you can see it in our trees as well. They're definitely not leafing out the way they should be at this time. So just a map that kind of shows some of the areas of where we're sitting for rainfall and where we're sitting for moisture. And when you look at the western side of the province, we're basically less than 5 millimeters of rain, and most of the western side. And then when you go a little bit to the east towards Brandon, we're still not very high. We're only in that 5 to 8, and actually you need to go fairly far to the east, the Gladstones, Pilot Mountain areas, before we even get up to that 8 to 11 millimeters. So really the whole province hasn't received a whole bunch of rainfall, especially, but when you look at the southwest here, we're definitely sitting in drier conditions. So then when you look at our soil moisture again is something that I guess everybody's really concerned about right now. We're still sitting at adequate, and for the majority of the area. Some areas are dry, but I guess on average we're adequate. And you can see that because the crop is germinating, the crop is coming up. So we have enough to get the crop started, but we're definitely going to need some rainfall here over the next little while to keep things going. One of the other interesting things is our soil temperature, and it has not gone up a lot. It's sticking in that anywhere from that 9 to 10 degrees. When you look on the side here, you see all the different towns. Boissevain at 9, Killarney 8.6. These would be their average temperatures. Souris 8.6, Russell 9. So, a lot of them just in that situation where soybeans would nicely get germinated and growing. So, I guess it's a factor that we've been facing this spring, where it's not only been dry, but it's also been cool, and it's slowing the growth down of a lot of the crop. And this map here, just to kind of show where we have been sitting or where our average frost would be. And when you look at the far southwest corner here, we're pretty much past the point where we receive an average frost. They're still calling for temperatures down in that 2 to 3 degrees for a couple nights this week, especially when they're calling for a couple days there where we might get some precipitation. Again, Verdon, May the 16th to range on when we can. We've been getting some frost in the past, so we're pretty much out of the area for dangers of frost, except for when you get up into the Bertle, Hamiota areas where the potential is still there. And this map here, just to show the current weather condition that may be going through. Was talking to John just now, and they are getting some rain on the eastern side of the province, and you can see where some of the bands looks like they're going to be going. This area down in the States, where a lot of the soybeans and corn would be going in, is expecting anywhere from 3 to 5 inches, depending on where they are. So that'll definitely delay their seeding progress, and hopefully some of that'll push a little bit north and give us some rainfall. So to talk a little bit about what's been going on in the field, been getting a few calls about some issues in some of the cereal crops. And when you see this one here, you can see there's some white patches on the leaf. And what we're seeing there is some, in this case, the frost banding, not heat banding in cereals. And what it is the cool temperatures and the frosts we've been getting at night, you know, basically are causing wherever that plant was at the soil surface, it either froze or experienced some wind type issues, but in this case it would have been frost, and it caused the tissue to be damaged. With cereal crops, we don't really need to worry too much about it yet, because when the growing point is usually below ground until about the 5 leaf stage, and it can handle frosts, up to -6. And, we haven't been getting that cold, but definitely -2 to -5 have been around. And so we're seeing some symptoms in the field. And that banding is just a line that usually is where the plant is at the soil surface at that time when the temperature drops. So depending on the crop, the evenness of the crop, when you look across the field, you'd be able to see that band very similar on all the leaves. But this year, with a little bit of variance in our emergence, we're probably seeing it more in the older crops and the stuff that emerged fairly fast. In most cases, this is not going to be an issue, as these plants usually outgrow it. And when I show the next few pictures here, you'll see what's actually going on. Areas that were above the ground froze fairly good in this case. You can see where the band would have been, and it actually, in this case, went right across the leaf. When you get a situation like that, as the leaf gets older, usually that part of the leaf dies off. You can see there was in the kind of the 2 leaf stage when it was just coming through the ground, but all the new growth is fine, and you got new growth coming out the middle. So again, not a problem. In most cases, it'll outgrow it. And here's more where you can see where this is a little bit older field, and you can see where all these ones were affected as they were coming through the ground. So just factors because of the weather we've been having. Another thing I wanted to mention today was there's a weed seedling identification day going on in Carmen actually today, and in Brandon it'll be going on May the 29th from 1 to 3:30 at the Assiniboine Community College. With that, I'm going to ask Mandy if John's presentation is there, and maybe we could flip over to John and get into our insect update.
I do have it here. I'm just going to try sharing my screen. Yeah. Can you guys see it?
You bet.
Perfect. So there were no questions at this point for your presentation, Lionel. But John, you can go ahead and just please let me know when to advance the slides.
Okay, well, thank you, and thanks everyone for sticking through our technical difficulties of earlier. Actually, it might be good that Lionel went first today, because he was able to address the weather situation out there. So as I go through the different insects I'm going to speak about, maybe I'll try to tie in how these cool, dry conditions might be affecting the insects. So next slide. So I'm going to do a bit of an overview of some of the early season insects. We'll certainly cover cutworms, wireworms, flea beetles. I do want to touch on diamondback moth and grasshoppers, some insects that we monitor or we're wanting people to keep an eye on going into this year. Next. So for cutworms, I always like to compare dingy and redback cutworm this time of year for people, because even though they're both cutworms, they are different species. They feed on the crop differently, and what you see on the plant will differ. So dingy cutworm is the one that I've been getting some samples and questions on recently. The reason is they overwinter as a partially grown larva. So right now, they're already a larva that is big enough that you can find them, and you might be seeing some of the feeding damage. Now, just to put it into perspective, most of the samples that have come into me, people have been finding one or two or a few. There's been no highly economic or even no economic situations so far. Just something people are keeping an eye on. Dingy cutworm is not a clipper, so they rarely cut plants. They will come out of the soil, take a few nibbles or notches out of a leaf, and then go back in. So what you see during the day scouting is a little bit of defoliation, but you rarely will see cut plants, so people often aren't thinking cutworm. All they know is something nibbled on this plant, but they're not often thinking cutworm. If that scenario is happening, dig around some of the damaged plants and see if potentially it is dingy cutworm. Like I said, a few of them being found right now, nothing economical yet. So at this point, we wouldn't be recommending something that you need to spray for unless you're starting to find a lot of them. Next. And so redback cutworm, the other species that seems to have been abundant the last few years, redback cutworm, people usually don't start noticing these until later May or early June. The difference is they overwinter as an egg. So right now they will be very tiny cutworms. They're probably not doing a lot of feeding yet, and they'd be hard to find in the field right now. So another week or two, they'll be a bit bigger. One of the things that is distinctive is they are one of the cutworm species that will do more clipping. Now, in my photos, these are quite large cutworms. They're fourth or fifth instars, so they're quite large. This photo would have been taken, this was a few years ago. I think it was late May or early June when I took this. So this is them later in the season. Once they get into those later instars, they will start doing their telltale clipping, and then people often piece together that, yes, there's cutworm feeding in my field. So keep an eye on that. We do encourage people, scout for cutworms. They're very patchy often, so if you know that there's a particular patch in the field, scout that area a bit more intensively, particularly around the edge of the patch. That's where you'll get an idea what your numbers are like. Next slide. I'll throw in one more cutworm. This one we don't see as often. It's called dark-sided. It almost looks like redback cutworm, but instead of red lines down the back, they're more very, very light brown to grayish lines. And they call it dark-sided because it's got those two brownish lines along the side of its body. So the sides along the darker stripes along the side of the body, that's what gives them their name, dark-sided cutworm. And they also will overwinter as eggs. They're very similar to redback cutworm, and you often do find both species in the field at the same time. So next slide. Just a few comments on cutworms. I mentioned they can be patchy. So again, when scouting, try to identify those patches. At times, people can get away with just doing a patch spray in the field. So if that's the situation, saves you a lot of money and insecticide use. Give you an example, a field that we were in a few years ago is a sunflower field. They had about 30 acres out of a much larger field that was heavily infected with cutworms. The rest of the field was pretty clean. The farmer told me that field was his thistle patch the year before, which makes total sense. When they're laying their eggs in late summer, usually August, early September, they're looking for a nectar source as well, and there's certain vegetation that seems to attract them better. So sometimes those weed patches, late flowering patches of crop, late flowering crops, those things might draw them into a field or an area of a field, and you get these patches. So again, for control purposes, you can focus on those patches. As far as how the weather might affect them, in dry weather, they tend to go deeper into the soil. So they will go up to about 5 centimeters. So when you're scouting, you may need to dig down deeper in the dry soil, up down to about 5 centimeters. What I like to do is either take a sieve out to the field with me or a tray, and I'll dig my soil put it through the sieve, look for cutworms. If your soil is not a soil that goes through a sieve easy, another way you can do it is just take a tray or something and dig the soil with your trowel, put it in a tray, and shake the tray just to smoothen out the soil, and you might find the cutworms. I've known people that just go out there with a spade, dig up the soil, smooth it around a bit, look for cutworms that way. People have different methods, but again, do check those patches. And drier soils, you may have to go down to about 5 centimeters. Next slide. So for control options, there really isn't a lot for cutworms. There's 3 insecticide groups that are registered for cutworms and field crops. So, and check the guide to crop protection. It'll vary with the crop. We've got the diamides, which is your coragen, and for those growing canola or corn, you do have seed treatment options, Lumiderm or Fortenza. Coragen, same class of chemistry, different product, same class, diamide group. This group tends to have a very long residual to it, so they will last a long time. They're semi-selective. They will kill cutworms, grasshoppers. It's quite good on grasshoppers as well, but it's pretty much harmless to bees, parasitic wasps, anything in the group that we call Hymenoptera, your bees and your wasps. So that's a good attribute, but you probably will pay a few dollars more for this compared to some of the other control options. The other control options are some of your older chemistries, your pyrethroids and organophosphates. They work well. I often get the question, pyrethroid or organophosphate, which is better for cutworms? And I usually don't play favorites for groups of products, but there has been testing head-to-head between organophosphates and pyrethroids. Most of the tests, the pyrethroids end up being better options. They generally do give better cutworm control. These are, again, older chemistries, fairly cheap, and quite readily available. We'll go to the next slide. So wireworms. Another insect that is in the soil. Now, big difference between wireworms and cutworms. Cutworms will come out of the soil to feed. At least the species that I described today will come out of the soil to feed. So insecticides, foliar insecticides, can work against them. Wireworms do not come out of the soil. They do all their feeding below ground. They like to feed on the seeds. Once the seed starts germinating, the portion below ground they will feed on. So sometimes when the plants come up, they look a bit shredded when they emerge. Other times they just don't emerge. The seed's been damaged and nothing emerges. Sometimes you'll even find the wireworms right in the seed. Now, we do have different species of wireworms. There's about 30 pest species in Canada, or potential pest species. I've got 2 different ones in my photo. The one on the upper right of your screen, that is, there's no common name for that species. Hypolithus bicolor is the species. Oh, sorry, Hypnoides bicolor is the species. It's our dominant species here. And most fields, that's majority of what we find. It tends to be a smaller species, a paler species, very light yellow, smaller, and wireworm for wireworm, it doesn't do as much damage as the prairie grain wireworm. On the lower left is the prairie grain wireworm, bit of a darker, larger species. We do find them, just not as common. And because of the prevalence of the Hypnoides here in Manitoba, our wireworm issues aren't nearly as severe as some other provinces in Canada. As you move further west into western Saskatchewan, into Alberta, you get a different species complex, which tends to be a bit more destructive. But that being said, we still do encourage you, keep an eye open for wireworms. If you see patches that didn't germinate well, that are unexplained, dig around, have a look. There's absolutely nothing you can do this year if you find you've got a heavy wireworm infestation in an area, but you want to file that away in your notes. And next year at seeding time, there are seed treatment options that you can choose if you have some bad patches. So we'll go to the next slide. Wireworm imposters. It's always good to know what looks like but isn't a wireworm. One that I often get calls on is something called therivid larva. So that's on the right of your screen. A couple differences between them. First of all, therivids are predators. If they could, they'd love to feed on a wireworm. So they feed on earthworms, cutworms, wireworms. They're very quick, very good predators. So if what you're finding is therivids, you've got a good thing happening in your field. To look at them, the wireworms, if you look carefully at the picture on the left, you will notice 3 pair of very small legs up near the head. Wireworms have legs, even though they're small, wireworms have legs. Therivids are fly larvae. There is absolutely no legs on them. Actually, the easiest way to tell them apart, aside from color and no legs, if you poke at them, the therivid larvae will go snaky. They squiggle and wiggle around like crazy to try to escape. So if they do that snaky dance on you, it's a therivid. If they kind of try to walk away but aren't moving that quickly, they are probably a wireworm. Both would be in the soil, so they're things you'd be digging up as you are checking in the soil. And just as a side note, the therivids become a very hairy fly as adults. So if you've got a fly that looks bigger than a house fly that has so much hair that it almost looks gray, it could be a therivid. That's what the adults look like. So we'll go on to the next slide. Another one that I want to show is an enchytrid worm. Enchytrids are small. So what you're seeing next to the fingernail is a fully grown enchytrid. They are very similar to earthworms in their biology and what they do. They like to feed on fungi, decaying plant material. So they're a decomposer essentially. So if you've got lots of stubble, trash in your field, you might build up a decent enchytrid population, which is a good thing. But do not worry if you find these almost transparent, tiny little worms. They aren't going to hurt your crop at all. So next slide. And natural enemies of wireworms, we do have a few. Again, you unfortunately can't use a foliar spray if you find them, but there are things out there feeding on them. The photo here is a ground beetle. So ground beetles are very quick little beetles that scurry along the ground surface. I can almost guarantee, unless you've sprayed a broad spectrum insecticide in a field recently, you will have a lot of ground beetles. They're very common. We have roughly 350 species in Manitoba, very abundant, but they don't often get seen a lot because they're nocturnal. They come out at night and hunt, and they hide during the day. If you disturb them by kicking over a clump of soil or some debris, they will run quickly to get away. But they're good. They will sometimes get right into the soil, feed on things like cutworms, wireworms, grasshopper eggs. There's another group of beetles called rove beetles, or staphylinids, as entomologists like to call them. Small little beetles running around in the soil, feeding on small wireworms, insect eggs, things like that. I've already mentioned therivids. And there's another big group that aren't insects. They're called nematodes. There's plant-feeding nematodes and there's predaceous nematodes. Some of the predaceous nematodes do feed on wireworms, so they can be helping out the cause. And there's also a fungus called Metarhizium anisopolae that will infect wireworms. The people at the Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada Research Station and AgUC-BC, they're actually working with this fungus to see if they can make it into a biological insecticide for wireworms. So we'll keep you posted on that one. So next slide. Okay, flea beetles. Flea beetles have become quite a chronic problem in Manitoba. And when we talk about flea beetles are actually a large group of insects. There's about 70 species roughly in Manitoba for flea beetles. And there's 10 of those species that can or will feed on crucifer crops like canola. Now, of the 10 that do feed on canola potentially, there's really 2 that you will see a lot of in your field. The other 8, you'll find the odd one, but they're not a problem. If it was just those 8, we wouldn't have flea beetle issues. it's two imported species, the crucifer and the striped flea beetle, that cause all the damage. The one on your left, you can see the two yellow stripes on it. That's our striped flea beetle. And the one on the right is the crucifer flea beetle. So those are your two more damaging ones. There is a difference between them biologically. The striped flea beetle comes out earlier. It is more active in cooler weather. The crucifer flea beetle tends to emerge a bit later. So right now, our summer students and myself, we've been out sweeping the ditches looking for whatever's there really this time of year. And predominantly what we're seeing right now is still the striped flea beetles. There's the odd crucifer getting mixed in, but it's still predominantly striped flea beetle. That will change over the coming weeks. By the end of May and into early June, the crucifer usually starts to become the more dominant species here in southern Manitoba. We'll go to the next slide. So when you're scouting for flea beetles, you're trying to assess the damage to your crop, and ultimately your goal is to get the plant to the 3 to 4 leaf stage before there's too much damage. Most of the threshold research that we currently use is based on studies from the 80s. The research is being reevaluated and updated, but the recommendations that were initially put out still seem to be holding, that once you get 3 to 4 true leaves on the plant seems to be able to compensate for further feeding. So the challenge is to get it to that 3 to 4 leaf stage before you get significant feeding. We'll go over in a minute what significant feeding is. So keep an eye on things. The biggest risk we have for flea beetles is if you seed the crop and it sits there in the either seed or seedling stage for more than about 3 to 4 weeks. The seed treatments you have on your crop should give you 3 weeks of protection minimum. Depending on the product, you might get 4 weeks or a little more out of it, but any more than 4 weeks, those seed treatments have probably worn out. If you're already at the 3 to 4 leaf stage by then, you're probably good to go. If not, you need to be scouting very carefully looking for feeding damage. We'll go to the next slide. So feeding damage. So what flea beetles do is they've got mandibles. They chew on the plants, but being very tiny insects, they usually don't chew right through the cotyledon or the leaf. They remove a portion of that surface, leaving a pit on the plant. Those pits eventually dry out, and sometimes they break open, and you get these little holes that you see on your screen. So that's what flea beetles do. Now, individually, they can't do a lot. It's just the sheer number of them that makes the damage. So on the screen here, you can see a few pits. And my question here is, what percent defoliation is this? If all your plants looked like this, should you be worried and concerned? So we'll go to the next slide, or hit the next. There we go. So the answer to the quiz here is, this is 10% feeding. So 10% is not significant. If on average you had this amount of feeding on your plants, and your seed treatment seems to be wearing out, at this point we'd be saying hold off. If this is as great as your feeding gets, it's not economical for you to be spraying. You're spending more money than your insecticide will return for you. So we'll go to the next slide. Okay, same question. What percent defoliation is this? So I'll give you a minute to look at it here, a few seconds anyway, and we'll make a decision on this. So you can see on this one here, there are areas that have been chewed out pretty good, but I do want you to note that there's also a lot of green left on here. We'll go to the next slide here. I'll hit the advance key. So this is 25% defoliation. Now, most people guess too high with this. We've done training exercises previously where we've had people try to ID defoliation for us, and it is very natural for people to overestimate defoliation. The reason being, your eyes are always drawn to the damage, and it often will look horrible when it's at 25%, but really there is a lot of green still left here. Certainly roughly 3/4 of the leaf material, or in this case cod lead material, is still green. So this is 25%. If on average things are looking like this is the point where we would say consider an insecticide application. This is the economic threshold, and the current research that's being done, at least preliminary, seems to validate this threshold. So we'll go to the next slide. So this one is 50% defoliation. So you can see a lot of patches here that have become blackened, necrotic, a lot of shot holes. This is actually what we call the economic injury level. So, sorry, we'll go to the next slide or advance. Get our answer up here. So this is 50% defoliation. There's also a bit of stem feeding here, which you would also want to factor into your decision making. This is actually the economic injury level, the point where insecticide application costs usually equal your yield loss. We don't want you to make your decision at this point because flea beetle feeding can advance very quickly. Hence, we go with the 25% as a good point to make your spray decision at. So we'll go to the next slide. And I'm just going to cover a few aspects on seed treatments, then we'll go on to a few other insects. So seed treatments for flea beetles, you've essentially got your neonicotinoids. Again, I usually bank on about 3 weeks. Sometimes you might get a bit more. The reality is it does depend on the temperature and the dryness of the soil. There was a bit of research done on this in Saskatoon. Bob Elliott did some good studies on this. And from his research, they found that the neonic seed treatments were more effective in dry soils than in wet soils, and more effective at 20 and 30 degrees than at 10 degrees. So now we do have dry soils. I think the wet soil part to it might be the neonics are very water soluble. So if you get a lot of heavy rains, you could have some basically solubility happening where the chemicals being diluted out or washed off from the seed. That's a possibility. But in his studies, excess soil moisture reduced effectiveness. And once again, warmer temperatures seem to increase effectiveness. So just something to keep in mind if you're trying to anticipate how long your seed treatments might be holding up for you. The other options you do have, Lumiderm is a diamide product. If you have that on, you may have a bit of an extension on your length of protection. And Lumiderm, of course, also will give you some cutworm control if you have that on your seed. And the other group of chemistry that's out there now is Basivio, the sulfoxamines, very similar to the neonics. And again, they may give you a little bit extended flea beetle control if you have gone with Basivio. So we'll go on to the next slide. I do want to mention, at least briefly, alfalfa weevil. In 2015, we started to have some really bad problems with this insect. 2016 was quite a bad year. 2017 was really bad. And then 2018, they really crashed on us. And I'm hoping the same trend continues. So alfalfa weevil, for anybody who's scouting or growing alfalfa out there, alfalfa weevil is a beetle, has small green larvae, they like to feed up on the buds, the flowers, the young growth. Severe defoliation can be an issue. For hay growers, we usually recommend cut a bit early. If you cut when they're still quite young, a lot of them will die of desiccation and starvation. Now, the reason I think the population crashed is a parasite, Bathyplectes curculianus. It's a very tiny black wasp. In surveys that we were doing over the past several years, we did see the population starting to climb on us. And I think it probably got to a point in 2018 where the natural enemies finally caught up with them and the population crashed. Usually when that happens, you do get a break for at least a few years. And experience from Eastern Canada is once that parasite, Bathyplectes cuculanus, gets established in an area, it can do a great job regulating the populations. So my hope is that will happen here. And if that does happen, it'll really help our growers out a lot. There won't be the same need for insecticides in seed alfalfa. And again, hay crops, we usually recommend you to cut early if it's becoming an issue. We'll go on to the next slide. Just a note, if you are concerned about alfalfa, we will have questions on scouting, thresholds, need more information. I'll just refer you to our fact sheet we have on our website. I'm not going to cover all that in this webinar due to time, but if you need more information, we do have a good fact sheet on our website. We'll go to the next slide. So grasshoppers, I do want to touch on these. We encourage agronomists, farmers to start scouting for grasshoppers, usually late May, early June. The cool temperatures we've been having probably will slow down the development of grasshoppers. I expect most of the emergence to start happening in those first 2 weeks in June. I'm not expecting a lot of emergence of our pest species in May this year because of the cool temperatures. Some might counter that statement by saying, yeah, but I've already seen grasshoppers hopping around. And my rebuttal would be those probably aren't pest species. We do have a few species of grasshoppers that overwinter as partially grown nymphs instead of as eggs. Those are not pest species. You will find them in pastures to some degree, maybe a little bit in the roadside ditches, certainly meadows and things like that. If you've been hiking at Spruce Woods or somewhere, this time of year you will see grasshoppers jumping around. Those are not your pest species. Any grasshopper that has colored wings when it flies, clicks when it flies, or is an adult, or at least a large nymph this time of year, is not one of your pest species. And on the upper right of your screen, you will see grasshopper eggs. That's the stage they're going to be in right now. As a side note, people will often ask, what if we get 2 inches of rain and our ditches and our fields become covered in water for a day or so? Short answer is it'll do nothing. A colleague of mine took grasshopper eggs and dropped them in a glass of water for a week, dumped the water out, and the eggs hatched. The eggs are very resistant to flooding and water. However, once those eggs hatch, those young juveniles are a little on the wimpy side. They do not handle excess rain too well. They're about the size of a wheat kernel when they hatch out, and a rain that floods an area, even periodically, can cause significant mortality to grasshopper nymphs. So conditions that can really decimate a grasshopper population are generally a lot of heavy rains in early to mid-June. That can really knock the grasshopper population back. Wet and damp conditions later in the season can also hurt the grasshopper populations. There's a fungal pathogen that can kick in and knock the population back. So that's why grasshoppers will do better under hot, dry conditions. We've had 2 hot, dry summers in a row. If we get a third, I will say be scouting for grasshoppers. There could be a bit of a resurgence should we get another hot, dry season. So that being said, we'll go to our next slide. So the next slide is a grasshopper forecast map. So this was put together based on a survey that we did last August. Every August, people go out and they walk ditches and field edges and do counts. And we put this forecast map. So this does not look too intimidating right now, this map. There's anything green suggests you're at a lighter risk. When you get into the yellow and the orange, the risk is a little higher, and certainly red, we'd be saying be really careful. There's no red on the map. There's some yellow and orange patches. But really, to put this map into perspective, you really need to be looking at the grasshopper forecast from the previous few years. So we'll go to the next slide. And what I want you to notice here, 2015, when we did our counts, we had a lot of orange and yellow on the map. So that's in the upper left. That was we were having, it wasn't really an outbreak of grasshoppers. We had some higher and certainly economic populations happening in the early 2010s. So the 2013, 14, 15, there were some higher levels. Then we got the conditions that I talked about, some really heavy June rains that really were flooding out a lot of the areas where they were developing. And you can see what happened in our 2016 forecast. Population crashed, and it stayed low. The 2016, 17, and 18 maps had next to no yellow or orange at all. The forecast for 2019 showed a lot more yellow and orange than the 2018 map did. So we are seeing a bit of a resurgence, and again, that's because of the last two hot, dry years. So again, if we get another hot, dry season, grasshoppers will be something you'll want to be scouting for. So I encourage you, look around the field edges, anywhere where there was lush green vegetation in late August and September. Those are areas you want to focus on doing your early scouting. When grasshoppers are laying their eggs, they usually don't hang around a field that has been worked up and doesn't have any green vegetation. They will go to the ditches, the field edges, they'll hang out there, lay their eggs there. So that's why we always encourage you, scout those areas early for grasshoppers. And this year, it's something that we will want to be doing. So we'll move on to the next slide. And to cycle back to where I started with my grasshopper talk, when we talk about grasshoppers, there's actually 4 species that give them a bad name here in Manitoba. We've got roughly 85 species of grasshoppers, and 4 of them we consider to be pests. There's a lot of non-pest grasshoppers. The ones on the right in my photos here, those are katydids. You will see a lot of these in your ditches, field edges, late in the season. They almost never move into the fields and do crop damage. So katydids, do not worry about them. There's grasshoppers, when they fly away, they have black hind wings. That species is called Carolina grasshopper, very abundant on the roadsides. They love to bask on country roads in the summer. When you drive up to them, they fly away, you get this flash of black. They're not a pest species either. They rarely move into our crops and do damage. The two-striped grasshopper on the left, definitely a pest species. Migratory grasshopper, another one of our pest species. And my point here is, when you are doing your checking, don't be counting katydids and things like that as potential pests. One of the things we're going to focus on this year at our crop diagnostic school is getting to know your pest grasshoppers, because sometimes it is good to know pests from non-pests. And we'll go to our next slide. So the other thing that will be hopping in a ditch very soon is leafhoppers. When I talk about leafhoppers, there's lots of different species. There's aster leafhopper, which can be a problem if they blow in and we get lots of them. But we have a lot of native species of leafhoppers. We've got roughly 300 species of leafhoppers in Manitoba. And all of them are, the only 2 that can be economical are potato leafhopper and aster leafhopper for people growing field crops. The rest are benign, and you will find a lot of them in your field edges and ditches. On the right is your leafhopper. On the left is your juvenile grasshopper. So don't be confusing the non-pest leafhoppers for grasshoppers when doing your ditch scouting. So we'll move on to the next slide. I'm just going to wrap up by going over our diamondback moth monitoring program. So we've got my number here is from our 2017. That should have been updated. We've got about 90 traps up this year for diamondback moth across Manitoba. We'll go to our next slide. So these delta traps that we've put up, they'll be collecting moths on a weekly basis. We change a little sticky insert, and there's a lure to draw in the moths. My precaution is you can get a lot of moths stuck to the inserts of these traps and not get economic populations in a field. Sometimes we get high numbers of parasites that blow in with the diamondback moth, and if the balance is in the parasite's favor, those high levels that blow in don't always become an issue. So my concern is I don't want people using the trap data to decide they want to spray a field. The trap data is to advise you to get out there and look for the larva. That's really the only benefit for it. If we have some high pockets popping up, we encourage people to get out there and scout for the larva. So we'll move on to our next slide. So here's what we've been finding so far. Nothing too alarming. In fact, in the Southwest, the only trap to record any diamondback moths so far is a trap near Rosedale where 2 moths were caught. Ironically, there's been a few more caught up near the paw than there has been in the Southwest, but that's not, we've had situations before where the Northwest can get a lot and the Southwest less. The diamondback moth does blow in, they move in on air currents, and a lot depends on where they get dropped. And sometimes it takes a rain event or just the way the winds are moving to drop them in an area. And it's very unpredictable. If by chance we get a lot, say in Swan River and the Paw, it doesn't mean that Brandon, Surrey, Verdant should have a lot. It all depends on where the winds essentially drop these pockets of moths that are being blown in. So far, our high counts have been more further east. Steinbach 25, Elm Creek 21. But again, these are not extremely alarming numbers at this point. So keep posted. We'll be updating our counts weekly in our Manitoba crop pest updates, and we'll be posting them on our website as well. So we'll go to the next slide. And actually, that is it. So there's, I think, just a few minutes left. So hopefully there's time for a question or two if you have any.
Thanks very much, John. Currently, there are no questions. For anyone, we can wait for a few seconds in case anyone wants to ask a question.
John, it's Lionel here. Manny, could you give me the screen back, please?
Sure
I have
can.
a picture I wanted to show you, John, and I had it set up for when you were going to start the beginning here. And so is that the thrivet you were talking about?
Okay, you've got a couple of different things happening there. Was this, yeah, that is thrivet larva, the white squiggly worm. That is the thrivet, yes. Again, visually, you'll notice there's no legs on it. And if you were to poke at that thing, I'm sure it would go nuts on you. And
Yeah,
you dug it up with some cutworms, did you, Lionel?
What's that?
Did you dug that up around some of the cutworms?
Yeah, it came up at the same time.
Yeah, okay, so that's good. That would be interesting in feeding. Good picture here as well. You can see on the left of your screen what looked like little tire tracks going down that cutworm next to the theriva. That is your dingy cutworm. Was this a recent find, Lionel?
Actually, it was my picture from last year. So.
Ah, okay. I was going to say, yeah, that is one of our species that overwinters as a partially grown larva. And now the other one up on the upper right is not one of our common early season cutworms. Was this taken more in June last year?
Yeah.
Okay, because it looks like you've got some armyworms up at the top and a dingy cutworm further below and a therivid, which would make sense if it was a June photo.
Yeah, I think the big thing when I took it was when me and the producer were out there, we seen the therivid, and we weren't quite sure what he was. Everybody first thought it was a different kind of wireworm, but that's what at first that's what it kind of would make thin like a wireworm, but it's just wrong color, eh? And no legs, like you had mentioned earlier on.
Yeah, and that's actually very common. Almost everyone who sends me a photo or a sample of therivid, the question that goes along with it is this a wireworm? And they're confused because the The coloring doesn't seem quite right. It looks a little different, but in many ways it's, I'll say, wireworm-like.
John, I have one question here. How much would you take into account stem feeding for flea beetle damage? And is there any way to compare a few bites on a stem to percentage leaf damage?
Yeah, that's actually a really excellent question, and we had a huge discussion on this among us entomologists a week ago. Right now, there isn't a formula or method for factoring in stem feeding into the threshold that we've developed, that 25% defoliation. I wish there was an easy way and we could say 5 pits or 10 pits. The problem is a pit isn't necessarily a pit. Sometimes they will take 1 or 2 bites and the stem is still sturdy and it doesn't seem to be doing a lot. Other times they will take several bites in an area. So bite probably isn't the proper word, but pit. Some pits are deep and big and the plant just topples over. Other pits are shallow and less consequential. So there isn't a way where we can really look at and tell you to count pits. It's almost a gut feeling you have to make. Pits that are deep and look like the plant is likely going to, topple over, be severed, that plant will be essentially 100% damage at some point. So it's almost a gut feeling that you have to have and factor in. It's a very good point. Under cooler weather like we're getting right now, you may see more stem feeding. They may be on the cotyledons less. They may be more on the soil surface feeding on stems. And if you're seeing a lot of that, even if you're below 25%, but a lot of stem feeding, sometimes thresholds are a bit of an art and a science. And sometimes you have to make almost a gut call that, yeah, we're not quite at 25, but there's a lot of stem feeding. And I'll say there are cases where feeding under 25% could be economical to treat if there's a lot of stem feeding. So hopefully that answers the question. I guess the short answer would be we really don't have a great way to factor it in.
Perfect. And with that, that was all of the questions we had. Thanks everyone for attending. Thanks, John, and thanks, Lionel. Have a great week.
Okay, thank you.